Welcome to 3 Point Cyber, a podcast about cybersecurity topics and events for the layperson. The ideas, opinions, and discussions of this podcast are those of the host, co-host, and guest, and do not necessarily represent the views of their respective employers or affiliates. Recording and propagation of this podcast is highly encouraged as long as an acknowledgement is given to the ownership. Music and graphics used in the podcast and promotional materials cannot be used in other events not tied to the podcast without the express written consent from Alpha Omega Advisors. Well, we're back, Andrew, once again. How are things going for you?
Yes, we are.
Yeah.
As good as can be expected. I got to tell you, it's been an absolutely beautiful day. The sun was out, but it was really, really cold. And I have a theory that I'm going to put out there that the temperature can be -2 degrees. And if it's sunny versus cloudy, it's always going to be colder, -2 on a sunny day than a cloudy day.
Well, that cloud cover keeps the warmth in.
Well, no, I mean, it's -2, so it shouldn't be, but I think it's psychological. There's something sinister going on. It's the sun's out. The expectation is warmth, right? So yeah, that's my theory. I'm sticking with it.
You're trying to
about
make
wind chill.
Yeah, you see, you're trying to make sense in a world that's nonsensical right now. So yeah, so I guess I could rub it in again and tell you, well, I'm looking out my window. It's sunshining and it's about 78 degrees here right now. So, what can I say? It's Florida. Yeah,
it's Florida. Your eyes say, help me, I'm in Florida. So
Well, the weather here, I can wait 10 minutes and it'll be pouring down rain, and then 10 minutes later it'll be balmy and 95. So
there you go.
Yeah. I guess we could find our faults no matter where we live, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. So we are on episode 5 of 3 Point Cyber, and we've had we've had a fantastic time interviewing some of the people that we've had on, some high quality people that I really respect. And today is going to be another one of those. The gentleman that I have coming on shortly, he's, I don't even know where to start with Mac. Mr. McMillan has been in my background for quite a while since I've entered cyber in one way or another. Full disclosure, I did use his company as a part of our cybersecurity program where my last position was as a CISO. His company performed our annual risk assessments and provided a lot of valuable information on how to build programs, and I sure appreciated what they did for us. So one of the things I wanted to pull out for Mac here for some background is the recipient in 2020 for the Malcolm Baldrige Award for Leadership Excellence in Cybersecurity. That award is issued and comes from the foundation that belongs to NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. It is a highly esteemed award, and I just think there was no one probably better that could receive that award than Mac. So a little bit about Mac. He's, I guess it's okay for me to say he's been around for a little while. I've been around for a little while, but he's been around for just a little bit longer than I have. He has 40 plus years of experience in senior executive positions and has held board memberships in several locations. He is focused in security and risk management for both government and industry. He's retired, and then, if I remember correctly, he came out of retirement to come back and do some work. And I don't think he's really retired. A little bit like me right now. I'm semi-retired, so I would say Mac's probably semi-retired. He is the co-founder and CEO of CynergisTek, an information security services firm specializing in consulting and in managed privacy, security, and audit services, as I mentioned earlier. That's the gentleman we're going to have on here, Andrew, and I'm really looking forward to getting into the discussion.
Well, me too. And you didn't tell the audience what the first retirement was.
Oh, I'm sorry. You're right. I didn't. I should do that. He is, and I'm going to have to thank him for his service when he gets on here, but he does have
absolutely.
He does have over 20 years in the Marine Corps.
Hoorah.
Yep. Here we go. We got another military person joining our ranks, and very much appreciated. So right after this, we're going to get right into our conversation. Well, we're back, and I am now going to introduce and bring on Mac. I really appreciate you taking the time and having our discussions with us today, Mac.
Well, I'm glad to be here, Dave, and Andrew. It's a pleasure to meet you, and I wish you all the best. And all the rest of your compatriots over there where you are. And obviously we always will be thinking about you.
Well, thank you very much. Pleasure's all mine.
And I should also say thank you, Mac, for your service as well. It is appreciated.
I appreciate
Absolutely.
that.
Yes.
My pleasure.
During the first part of the segment where I was given some background on you, I did mention the Malcolm Baldrige Award. Can you give us a little bit more insight onto that one? Because I think that's just a great honor.
Well, yeah, and I'll tell you, I was very humbled to receive that. I think I was only the second person to receive the Malcolm Baldrige Award in Leadership Excellence in Cybersecurity. I did some work with Malcolm Baldrige probably 7 or 8 years ago when they were integrating cyber into the Malcolm Baldrige criteria that they use for ranking hospitals as Malcolm Baldrige winners, which I thought was a great idea because not just because it was what we do, but because it's just so timely, right? It's become so important to industry in general and to healthcare in particular. But the Malcolm Baldrige Award basically recognizes individuals who have made contributions in their careers in the space of bringing standards, if you will, to how people build whatever it is they're doing, right? And there's different Malcolm Baldrige Awards in different categories, and the cybersecurity one basically it recognizes individuals who have basically promoted using standards in building excellence in cyber programs. So if you know me for a long time, you know that in addition to my other things that I do, I have been very much involved in education, and I'm a big proponent of standards-based programs.
Exactly. As far as I'm concerned, there's no one more deserving for that award than you, Matt.
Well,
I do appreciate
don't know about that, but I appreciate it.
So let's talk about things that's been going on in cyber. But a long time it was referred to as information security, right?
Yep.
And as we've kind of matured and things changed, it kind of migrated over to cybersecurity because it's more than just information we're trying to protect. It's just a wide range of things. So given the number of years you've been doing this, Mac, one of my biggest questions that I have for you is, what are some of the most significant changes that you've seen in the last, say, 15 to 20 years?
I think probably one of the biggest changes that I've seen, and I'm not necessarily convinced that it's a great change, I've seen it migrate more towards the technical side of things, meaning there's more emphasis on tools and solutions and programs and technology. And I think we've kind of sort of forgotten some of the very basic things that security relies on, which is people and reliance and process and readiness, and things that quite frankly are the Achilles heels that people are dealing with today, because we don't typically have hacks today, if you will, that are compromising systems in some sophisticated way. Basically, they're finding ways to get into our environments through mistakes that people are making. People they're not being disciplined in their hygiene. They're not doing a good job of patching. They're not monitoring. I mean, I looked the other day and at a group of hospitals. I had our guys go look at a group of hospitals just to give me an idea of how many actually had active monitoring, right, going on in their environments. And right now, at a time when we have things going on, like as you guys know, in the world, where we're worried about cyber threats and we're worried about secondary effects of what could potentially be going on, and even direct attacks. And the number of people, there were literally more than a third of the institutions that we looked at that don't have any active monitoring at all going on.
And Matt, can you describe what active monitoring looks like?
It's having somebody that's literally watching what's going on in your environment through either a security operations center, right, where you have basically analysts with eyes on glass that are watching activity, right, that are watching things going on in your environment, things that are hitting your firewalls, things that are hitting your other systems, things that are happening inside your system as well with respect to endpoints and that sort of thing, things that are happening with respect to your assets that are dispersed in the cloud or other locations. Just somebody actively monitoring what's going on, what the systems are telling us is happening. And when you think about it, I mean, if you're not doing that, you don't know what you don't know.
Is that resource intensive, or is that something that can be done in a fairly decent budget?
So it is resource intensive, but it's something that you can either do in-house, you can outsource, you can even co-source it if you know, in terms of having some semblance of folks inside your organization that are doing it with somebody outside doing the heavy lifting. I mean, Dave in particular, when he was the CISO at his last organization, had a great setup where he had folks in his organization that were doing some level of monitoring, but then he had another organization that was supporting him externally. And that's really how it works best. But the point is, we just have too many organizations that aren't monitoring at all. And that's just a formula for things to go wrong.
Yeah, and Mac, in your opinion, I know I've certainly have my opinion, and I usually share it pretty quickly, but I'd like to hear what you seem to think on this one. Why do you think that these companies are not doing that yet, or as rapidly or as fast as they should?
I think it's a couple of things. I mean, part of it, they're not doing it because they're not required to do it. I mean, there are some folks that literally, if it's not a requirement, they just don't do it. There are other folks that are not doing it for financial reasons, and as alluded to, because as you know, it does take some level of investment, and the organization has to get behind that. And in some cases, they don't do it because, I hate to say it, it's just not a priority for certain organizations. What's interesting is that their priorities change rapidly when they end up having a major incident.
Yeah, that's typically what I've seen happen as well. We had, in episode 2, we had a gentleman, Roger Grimes, on, and he has everything that he does, he backs up with data. And he collects years and years of data, and he always brings that out to make a point. And one of them in that was all about companies putting priorities in the wrong spot. And he has stats that can show that it's in the wrong spot. And even if you get a security program going, you tend to put the priorities on what you're trying to do in the security field, do the controls into areas that don't matter as much as other areas. And one of the big areas that he has, which is what you were alluding to earlier, by one of the changes that you don't believe is probably for the good over these past lots of years, and I happen to agree with you, that we tend to put more emphasis on the technical and the technology that's coming out and forgetting about the user that's behind all of it. And the stats are showing that it's typically, if something happens, it's usually not the technology that's failed, but it's one of two things. It's either they didn't deploy the technology correctly and are not using it correctly, or 2, it's the user that did something they didn't know they shouldn't have done, and they've caused an incident to occur. And if they would have been just educated a little bit, they probably would never have happened, or it could have been prevented.
Absolutely. And Dave, you know, one of the things that our organization has done for years is we actually do an analysis of all the hundreds of assessments that we do every year to try to look at where the trends are and patterns. And one of the things that we've started doing here just recently, which was post last time you saw it, is that we're actually doing things like overlaying the MITRE framework on top of it now, the results, right? And overlaying the most common reasons for a ransomware attack, right? And what's really interesting is that when you overlay those things, it lines up so well with where the deficiencies are in programs that we're seeing, right? The trends that we're seeing in terms of people not doing the things that they're supposed to do. And then it lines up very well with that MITRE framework. It lines up very well with that threat framework, with those reasons for why certain incidents occur. And you're like, it's no wonder it's happening. We're not doing the things that we need to be doing to stop it. And most of those things are not technical, like patching, right? I mean, you almost hate to have a discussion around patching. It's almost like, I mean, I've been doing this for 40 plus years, and I'm ready to say, do I really have to tell you to patch your systems? I mean, It's like, if I have to tell you to patch them one more time, you probably shouldn't be in this ball game.
Yeah.
We literally have thousands of systems that aren't patched. We literally have thousands of systems out there that are not supportable anymore, right? Which, you know, you and I both know is a formula for disaster. And yet we can't see our way to making some of those things more of a priority. And I don't care how much you spend on technology. I don't care how many tools you put in your inventory or how many systems you have watching what's going on. If you don't have a good baseline in your environment and good patching, if you will, good configuration management, et cetera, 2 things are going to happen. 1, you're still going to be susceptible to breach. And 2, those systems that you just spent all that money for are going to be less effective because they're going to be seeing things that are false positives or true negatives, but that shouldn't be there in the first place.
So Mac, I'm going to have to back you up and ask you, what is a MITRE framework?
MITRE is an organization out there, obviously, that does a lot of research, and they do a lot of research into threats, right? And what creates threat and what causes threats. And they've identified, I forget how many it is, different points of threat that can be in an environment. And those things align with the various NIST controls, right? And the maturity of those controls. And when we go out and do an assessment of a hospital, for instance, using the NIST framework, we're basically measuring that hospital's maturity against that control framework. Well, then you lay that MITRE framework on top of that, and all of a sudden you begin to see it line up in terms of the things that are weak, that are directly related to something bad happening.
Yeah, Andrew, that framework, it's a knowledge base and a model for cyber behavior that goes on in a lot of different realms. It's the threat world, company models. It all comes back into one overlay in how you're doing your security program. And that's some of the things that I've seen, Mac, is changing to me in a positive way, is we're starting to see a lot better maturity models starting to pop up. And I think it's because we've got some experience now behind us. When I first started out in the field, we were just getting to the point where we were educating the company's leaderships that you need to do some type of information security. You got to start protecting just your information. And then it started it started expanding, and then it got into more than just information. It started talking about how to secure your assets, how to secure your network, how to secure the people that are on those assets. Everything started getting a little bit bigger. Hence, I think the reason why cybersecurity started coming out, because it's more encompassing. And to me, that change that it's occurred over the last several years has been the positive side of these frameworks that are coming out that are maturing and helping an organization better position their own security programs. If the security leaders and the leaders of the organization have enough vision to know that that's where it's heading. And I think that's one of the issues we're still trying to play catch up in, especially in healthcare. It's still an afterthought. It's still not on the priority list for a healthcare company to bring this in and incorporate it. As you mentioned, I was fortunate enough to be in an organization that really, at a time that I came in, was really on the ball of having that was just on their forefront of getting their intellectual property taken care of. The healthcare people, from a HIPAA standpoint, needed to be secure. The data needed to be secure, and they were taking that seriously. So 6 years ago, this is when we started our first security operations center. 6 years ago in the healthcare industry seems like an eon ago. It seems like an ages ago. But when we brought that in, one of the things that we knew when we were going to be doing this and watching the network was we had to mature as well. Even in that area, we had to get outside resources, which is why we brought CynergisTek in to help us go year after year and kind of baseline us from one year to the next to see where our improvements were going on. But it was a couple of years ago, Mac, when I decided that the Security Operations Center wasn't even enough. There was a lot more that needed to be done, and that's when we started to moving toward threat hunting, and that's where when the MITRE framework starts coming into play. If you uncover something that's on your network, in my mind, it's already too late. You don't want to find that stuff. So that's why we started maturing the program and going into threat hunting, so you could actually go out and look for things that could cause problems in your environment.
That's a good point, Dave, and that's one of the things that I just came back from Chime last week, and one of the things that I talked about in my focus group with CIOs was the lack of environmental awareness that most organizations have with respect to what the threat knows about them, what they look like to the threat, and what the threat is actually doing. And the number of health systems that are actually doing active threat hunting or having somebody do that for them, or actually doing what we call digital defense, meaning understanding what you look like on the web and in the dark web, et cetera, it's just very few. It's a very small number. And Andrew knows this, being a military guy himself. One of the biggest programs we have in the military is operational security, right?
Oh, yeah.
And it's right. And you have to know yourself. You have to know where your vulnerabilities are, not just from a technical perspective, but what's important about what you're trying to accomplish. What does the enemy know about you? And the enemy in this case is a cyber criminal, right? But he's still an adversary. What does he know about you? What can he find out about you on the web? For instance, one of your people in your organization that goes to a third-party website and uses their corporate credential to log into that to create an account on that third-party site. That third-party site then gets compromised. That login and set of credentials, user ID, et cetera, gets compromised, and that gets shared on the black web. And now somebody on the black web knows exactly who one of your employees is and what their credential is, et cetera, et cetera. And it just goes on. And the question is, how many organizations even know that some of their corporate credentials have been compromised, or any of their corporate? And most of them don't, right? Or they can go to that employee and say, guess what, Dave, you're about to change your username and password because you were dumb enough to put it out there on iloveshoes.com or whatever, right? People aren't watching that stuff. People aren't watching what's going on. So they don't really know just how susceptible they are. And it's amazing. You've got hacker organizations today that are incredibly sophisticated, incredibly organized. They're sharing threat information. They're sharing their tools and their exploit information. They're sharing their victims' information. And you just cannot assume that they don't know something about you and that could potentially hurt you. But most of our organizations aren't doing that at all.
Yeah, it's not even that the threat actors are sharing the information among themselves, which they are, but it's also that you don't even have to be a technical person to even carry out attacks anymore, because these threat actors are now selling their services to do something. If you want to go hack a company or you want to go ransomware a company, you just have to go out and buy the service. And that's the dangers that's going on here. I hate to say this, but I think at the moment, the threat actor community is a little more collaborative than what we are in the private sector and the public sectors.
Well, I'd argue that they're a lot more collaborative than we are. I mean, we still have problems between organizations here in terms of sharing information, right? Which in my mind is just detrimental to everybody. When these things happen, these threat centers pick up on this stuff and or organizations pick up on it. We need to do a better job and have a better way of sharing information so that the next guy doesn't end up having to step on the same landmine as the guy before. It just, but we do that over and over again because we don't want to share.
We've talked about over the last several years, and you brought up the good point of some of the things that are changing. Now let's switch it. What do you think has been some positive steps forward, and conversely, some of the things that are occurring that, as far as change goes, that could be, that in your opinion might be more negative and that we shouldn't be doing, in our field?
Well, I think some of the positive, we do have some really unique and positive and powerful technology that has been developed. I just don't think that we're necessarily using it. One, I don't think we're using it in the way it was intended, but two, I don't think we're using it in probably the most effective manner we could. So for instance, one of the things that I'm a big proponent of today is that we need to take the fight back to the bad guys. We need to get more offensive in our strategy and less defensive. Why sit there and wait for him to get in and try to catch him? Why not go out there and figure out where he could potentially do that to me and stop it before he has a chance to do it? And when you look at these things, I mean, there's great tools out there now that allow us to do all kinds of analysis, like compromise analysis and security controls validation, et cetera. And typically we don't use those things until we're in a forensic mode, which is way too late, right? But what's interesting about those tools is I can use those tools proactively, and I can do two things. One, if I run a compromise assessment today, but I don't know there's an organization that doesn't know that they've been compromised, I can run a compromise assessment today, and it'll tell me one of two things. The first thing it'll tell me is if I have been compromised, which I kind of sort of would like to know before they have an opportunity to blow up my system, right? But even if I don't find evidence of compromise, what it will do is it'll find those areas in my environment where I could potentially be compromised. And guess what? Now I can take that information, tie it back to where I know is my controls environment, and look at the things that I can do to make changes to eliminate those possibilities, right? I can get proactive in blocking that guy from getting in. The same thing with security controls validation. When I grew up in DoD doing this way back when, part of our assessment process always had this thing called an ST&E at the end of it, a system test and evaluation. And what it said was, you have to have a policy, you have to have a procedure, you have to, et cetera, et cetera. But I don't believe what you tell me until you test it. And you have to test it in at least two different ways to assure me that control is actually operating and where it's in place, right? for some reason, that didn't make its way out into the private sector.
And it still hasn't. And I'm not seeing it even being discussed, because you're right. My time with the DoD as well, we didn't sign off anything until we've gone through a couple of iterations of tests and then evaluate the results before we would even write it off as successful or not. And today we're real quick to go out and buy a new security tool, put it in place, and think it's all working fine, when in reality it could be compromised and be in an incident and find out it didn't do what it was supposed to do, either because it couldn't or you didn't deploy it right.
And I'm here to tell you, it's not could, it actually is happening, and it's happening way more often than it should be.
Yeah.
And we now have the ability to actually test that, right? So, and in fact, one of the things that we do a lot now is we do what are called security controls validation assessments, where you actually simulate attacks to test various controls in the environment to see that they're, 1, deployed, 2, operating properly, 3, they react and do what they're supposed to do, et cetera. And what we're finding overwhelmingly is that they're not. That people who think a tool is deployed properly is not. People who think it's deployed throughout their environment find out that it's only on a part of their environment. People who think that somebody's monitoring actively aren't actually monitoring it actively. And so it's no wonder that these things are happening, and it's happening because you're right. We're just assuming this stuff is working, and we're not testing it. And the first thing you learn about in security is that a control not tested is a control not trusted.
Absolutely.
But that's not the way we operate.
Yeah. And unfortunately, as you mentioned, there's a lot of that still going on. I will admit, even in my own programs, we've had tools where I know we didn't take full advantage of even the tool. We either didn't fully deploy it, or we didn't use it in the way that the vendor or the company actually intended on being used. We didn't take it for what it was supposed to do. We just used a piece of it and not the full tool. And I think we have a tendency to do that way too often.
Yeah, a classic example of that is privacy monitoring. If you look at most of the privacy monitoring tools that are out there, they'll typically monitor for literally hundreds of different types of violations of privacy compliance. But most organizations use anywhere from 5 to 10% of the capability of those tools. And there's multiple reasons for that. But the most glaring ones are they don't have the resources to do it. They don't have the resources to follow up, because every time they identify that somebody potentially did something that they shouldn't have in the record, somebody has to then follow that up and take it to fruition.
Right.
And the other part of that is there's a real reluctancy to hold organizations accountable across the board with respect to activity. And so the way that you manage that is you just don't turn on all the checks that it could do.
Yeah, and I think you really hit it right there, Mac. That's been my experience as well, is you get at something that can expose a lot, and it turns out that the organization doesn't want to know everything that it could be found out, because there's going to be a whole lot more work to do.
Yeah. Fortunately, it's not everybody, but there are instances of that. And, unfortunately, those are the organizations that typically eventually get embarrassed or get affected by something that happens, that they find out that for 15 years, somebody's been doing something that they shouldn't have been doing. And we could have caught it in the first 6 months.
What's amazing to me, though, even after the fact of something like that, as your example, for 15 years, we should have known about it, but we didn't because we weren't looking for it. But in this case, you let it go on so long, it becomes a norm. And if you do find it, the security team is almost in a position where, well, why did you find this thing? Instead of the company looking at it as something bad that was happening, they're looking at the team wanting to know what you were doing to uncover something like that. Why are you doing that?
Yeah. The other thing that I think has evolved, that I think is probably one of the worst things that's happened, is this focus on grades and compliance. Because you and I both know as security professionals that compliance does not equal security. And you can, I don't care what compliance requirement that you show me or framework that you show me, I can be compliant and still not secure. And that's where we are today. And there's a lot of organizations that are still very much focused on their compliance score, and still very much, even on the NIST side, right? They'll say, well, am I a 3.2 or a 3.5? And my response to them is, sometimes a 3.2 is worse than a 3.5. Mm-hmm. It's It's what makes up your 3.2 or what makes up your 3.5. And in fact, there could be organizations that they're always worried about what their peers are or what their neighbor is. Well, the hospital down the street that's a 3.6 and you're a 3.9, while you're patting yourself on the back, you actually could be in worse shape than they are, depending on the things that equated to your 3.6 or your 3.9. And so we need to quit focusing on these scores. We need to quit focusing on grades and compliance and am I better than my neighbor? The question is, are you secure?
It sounds like getting spiffed up for inspection.
Yeah, exactly. You could be the best looking outfit on the drill field and suck in combat.
Exactly. Or be the best looking at that time, and then all the rest of the time you're looking like crap.
Yeah.
Well, we've just about exhausted our time. Is there any final thoughts you'd like to say? As a point of 3-Point Cyber is that we doing this for education purposes and trying to help further the cause of cyber inside of organizations. Is there anything you'd like to final thoughts that you might have?
Yeah, I think for me today, we all need to get into the mindset of being more proactive and being more offensive in how we think about security and execute our programs. And I think that, to me, there's three things that implies. And the first one is having better environmental awareness of what we look like and what the threat is and what the threat's doing in our environment and how we're susceptible. The second one is not trusting all the technology and the work that we're doing and making sure that we are actively testing and evaluating the security posture on a regular basis and monitoring what's going on actively so that we can anticipate things before they bite us. And then last but not least, if all else fails, make sure you are absolutely ready to respond to an incident, because you're going to have one, no matter how good you are, no matter how diligent you are. And the better you plan and practice today, the better you're going to play and perform tomorrow. And athletic teams know that, the military knows that, the first responders know that. I mean, everybody who has to perform knows that. The operating teams in the OR room know that. Use that same philosophy with respect to how you get ready for an incident. If you really want to be in charge, then practice to where you know what you're doing and can execute with what I call muscle memory instead of having to go rely on a checklist.
Yeah, very good. Well, thank you, Mac, for your time and for this great discussion. Really appreciate it.
You bet.
Thank you for listening to 3-Point Cyber, a production from Alpha Omega Advisors. If you have questions about this episode or have a topic for discussion or a guest you would like us to have on, please email us at 3pointcyber@gmail.com. That's 3, the number 3, point, P-O-I-N-T, cyber, C-Y-B-E-R, all one word, 3pointcyber@gmail.com. We encourage you to share this podcast with others. This podcast is owned and produced by Alpha Omega Advisors. The theme song was created by music producer Andrew Van Wert in Nashville, Tennessee. This is Dave Summit, and until next time, keep on learning.